commence the webinar. So good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to this third and final webinar in our series featuring the achievements and lessons of the first 10 years of the transition and recovery. I beg your pardon. Sorry. So the third and final webinar in our series featuring the achievements and lessons of the first 10 years of the Vermont Farm to Plate Plan and Network. Today's webinar is titled How the Public Purse Can Drive Food Systems Change, the Role of Institutional Procurement. So we're delighted to be sharing a very full program with you over the next 2 hours, featuring first Jake Claro, Program Director for Vermont Farm to Plate, Peter Allison, Executive Director of Farm to Institution New England, Leah Galvin, Churchill Fellow and Food Systems Consultant, and Veronica Graham, Manager of Healthy Eating and Physical Activity at the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services. We'll then have hopefully 15 minutes for questions, followed by a further 3 presenters, Tim Milsom, CEO of the Noongar Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Sophie Lamond, doctoral candidate at the University of Melbourne, and Julie Dunbaven, Executive Officer of the Tasmanian School Canteen Association. And then finally, a further 15 to 20 minutes for questions to conclude. Before formally beginning, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of the board and staff of Sustain that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge the custodianship of the elders, recognising that they and their ancestors stewarded these lands and their diverse creatures sustainably for tens of thousands of years. We acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded and that the process of historical truth-telling that will and must lead to justice for all First Nations peoples on the basis of a duly negotiated treaty is an urgent task for all Australians. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to any First Nations persons who may be with us today or watching this event subsequently. I'd also like to acknowledge that this series of webinars has been made possible by the generous support and collaboration of a wide range of partners across the country. They're too numerous to name individually, however, you can see all their logos now on the screen. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to all members of Sustain who are with us today. Your support means a great deal to us, and we thank you very much for it. For those who don't know, Sustain is a national sustainable food systems organisation and a registered health promotion charity. Our mission is to design and build better food systems, reducing the burden of chronic dietary-related ill health through collaborative, long-term and coordinated projects and initiatives. These webinars have been inspired by the work of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund in the development and implementation of the Farm to Plate Plan, and anyone who's attended either of the first 2 webinars will surely have been greatly impressed by the scope and impact of this work, which is now entering its 2nd decade. So now it's my pleasure, and I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Nick Rose. I'm the Executive Director of Sustain, but it's my pleasure to welcome our first set of presenters. I just ask anyone who's got their mic on to turn it off, please, to avoid background noise. To welcome our first set of presenters who will share their experience and perspectives on the role of institutional procurement as a lever for food systems change. So I'll briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Jake Claro is the Farm to Plate Director for the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and in that role, he is responsible for providing facilitative leadership and strategic coordination to the Farm to Plate's networks work to implement Vermont's food system plan. Peter Allison is Farm to Institution New England's Executive Director. He was the first staff person when FINE started back in 2011, joining the initial organising partners to promote a robust Farm to Institution network in New England. Leah Galvin has worked for over 20 years in a variety of settings, including state and local government and not-for-profit sector, delivering projects and campaigns to reduce barriers to eaters enjoying local healthy food. Last year, she was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to investigate approaches used by business and government to increase institutional procurement of locally produced food. And Veronica Graham has responsibility for state public health nutrition policies, initiatives and partnerships for the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services. Her dual role encompasses both emerging work supporting healthy food systems and access and working across state platforms such as sport and recreation, education industry, state parks and workplaces, as well as developing and implementing state nutrition policies and programs. So a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for generously giving your time to share with us your perspectives and experience, and I'll hand over now to Jake.
All right, thanks, Nick. Is my audio all right? That's one thing that I forgot to test in our little prep here.
All good.
I'm going to share my presentation with you all. Just 1 second. All right, and can everyone see that? All right. Good. So it's really nice to be back with this group. I think last time that I presented, I had a little more facial hair, but I kept the length of my hair the same, so you could recognize me. And so tonight, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiences with institutional procurement, and hopefully kind of set up Peter's presentation a little bit. We didn't have time to coordinate too much, so I hope I don't step on Peter's toes tonight. So apologies, Peter, in advance if I cover content that you're planning to cover. A reminder, so yeah, Farm to Plate is Vermont's 10-year strategic food plan, an initiative to collectively strengthen Vermont's food system. There's these three kind of primary legislative outcomes to increase economic development in the farm and food system, to increase jobs in the farm and food, jobs and establishments in the farm and food system, and then increase access to local food for all Vermonters. So as a part of that acts kind of both economic development and access, one of the critical goals of the first Farm to Plate strategic plan was to increase consumption, kind of procurement in institutional settings. And when we talk about that, we're very expansive in that meaning. So K through 12, colleges, state agency cafeterias, hospitals, and also prisons. I will basically be focused tonight on mainly K through 12 and colleges. So and a little bit of hospitals as well. And I think, you know, the kind of just to kind of set up why this goal in particular, you know, it kind of has some primacy as the second goal amongst 25 of our goals, is that, you know, definitely this notion that institutions are not only places of, you know, they're serving lots of meals, there's market opportunity for our farmers, but they're also establishing, you know, they're developing the next generation of not only consumers, but also leaders. And so there's this great opportunity to really shift culture in these institutional settings. And they're, you know, institutions are places of values, you know, sort of establishing long-term values and norms in our society. And so there's, you know, there's opportunity to influence that. And they're, you know, likely kind of good partners to be working with on advancing, you know, local economic development and developing future leaders. So just a quick little, this is actually not a very current model of our network, but I just wanted to kind of, you know, remind ourselves that, so we have this network, there's many groups. This inner ring is kind of what we call our working groups, those blue circles. And the place where a lot of our farm to institution work has happened over the years is in our aggregation and distribution working group. And the idea, you know, kind of the notion behind that is that gaining access into institutions there's a lot of logistical kind of pieces to that. And for smaller farms, you know, there's an element of aggregation and distribution that needs to happen for them in order to access that marketplace. So a lot of, you know, coordination between different entities in order to kind of enter into the institutional market. So that's why kind of a lot of focus on institutions has come out of our aggregation and distribution working group. And just a little also context of kind of the type of sales that are happening in our Vermont local food sales that are happening in Vermont institutions. This is from our own data collection from our local food, from a methodology that we've developed. Peter might have some different numbers as well. So, but just to give a ballpark, as you can see, you know, from 2014 to 2017, roughly about a 26.5% increase in the total institutional sales from about 6.5 million to 8.1. Higher ed is definitely the largest kind of buyer in Vermont amongst our institutions, at kind of, you know, almost getting close to $6 million. And of course, I can, you know, I should say, obviously COVID has had some impacts on the institutional sector. But I will say that from data that we've seen from our higher ed institutions, that While the total food spend is down, the percentages that they're spending in their budgets on local has remained the same over COVID. So I think it's just, they've still they've retained their commitments to local purchasing through COVID despite the impacts. And again, so that's 2.6% of our local food sales in Vermont. But sales is not the only component of why getting local food into institutions is important. Just that presence of local has ripple effects on students, and kind of how that then translates into longer term change. So interestingly, our work with institutions, kind of going back to around 2013, I show this map because the work that we started with institutions started actually around this question about asking Sodexo, which is a major food service provider, has the most accounts with our colleges and universities in Vermont. We were asking them, can you show us how much local you're buying? We just sort of wanted to be able to establish like a baseline and try to track that over time. And in those conversations, it was, the response back was, well, how do you define local? Like we can get you these numbers if we have a sense of what you mean by it. And we had this rough definition of, or kind of like a functional definition, I would say, of Vermont plus 30. So this was based on an interpretation of a local food statute that was passed through the Vermont legislature, that kind of is local is considered something that's produced or manufactured in Vermont or 30 miles kind of outside of the border, because that's local to certain places, border regions of the state. So based on that, we started to kind of have these conversations, and those conversations then evolved to, well, if we want to try to increase local purchasing in our institutions and with Sodexo, we need our producers to really understand how that system works, and we also need to introduce Sodexo to potential opportunities, producers who might be able to supply their institutions with local food. And at that point in time, there hadn't really been sort of deep relationships established between Sodexo's supply management team and local producers. So I mentioned this in the first call, is that there was this basically forum in 2013 that brought together all of these different entities. So the intermediaries, a lot of the nonprofits that were working on local, our Agency of Agriculture, with Sodexo's supply management team, and then producers kind of who are interested in entering into the institutional space. And in that process, they really were able to, describe kind of the process and the requirements, that Sodexo, what their requirements were for onboarding local producers. And we were able to then also, expose them to opportunities with local suppliers, and establish just a deeper real relationship, that we were committed to helping them increase their local procurement. And through that, this was a time of the state kind of renewing its food service contracts for its state colleges. And so there was a strong signal also that came through our Agency of Agriculture in this, that the state really wants to see this be a priority in the next contract. And so in kind of the negotiations of that renewal process, Sodexo was getting some signals that okay, the state's really behind this, a lot of local entities are really behind this, so we need to make some changes in order to really implement successfully local procurement for our for the universities and colleges that we're servicing. So what they did was they created this Vermont First program. They hired a Vermont First coordinator, whose job was specifically to build supply chain relations with local producers to increase, basically the way that Sodexo frames it is they're looking to increase their local like economic impact, on communities in the surrounding areas that of the clients that they have. So that's kind of the framework that they were thinking of it in. And so they hired, a dedicated person to actually work on this with their accounts. And I think I mentioned this as well, that on the first webinar, that this Vermont First program has now been adopted in Maine. It's called Maine Course. And so there's really been, Sodexo has really sort of used this as a model. We've also had additional meetings with some of some sustainability office management folks and other supply management members of their national team, because they're interested in bringing this to other states in the US. And from that, so now there's an advisory team, and this is some numbers from their fiscal year 19 report of the Vermont First program. But so there's an advisory team now that I'm a member of, that a number of other more influential and powerful people are members of in the state of Vermont, including the Agency of Ag has a seat on this advisory committee. And they've really opened themselves up through this advisory committee. So they give us all of their purchasing data. They have created kind of a purchasing kind of prioritization, like decision-making process based on, our input to them about products that are likely, available to them and that, kind of sync with their demand. And so just some numbers here, they're spending about 2.6 million. That's about 13.3% of their, or 13.4% almost of their total food spend, 169 local producers. And on the bottom there, that strategic sourcing, so they've got priority products. So this is a list of products that we helped kind of vet through the data that they were sharing with us, in kind of aligning their demand with local production. Then they have this Harvest of the Month program, which is a program that came out of our Farm to School network, some organizations, and it's basically a marketing kind of piece to what they do. So every month in their cafeterias, they're really highlighting a particular product, and that list has been also kind of developed in partnership with the advisory committee. And then the third piece, this local beef program, and that number about purchasing 32,000 pounds of local ground beef. Sort of interestingly, that program emerged out of kind of scrutinizing some of their beef purchasing numbers and their interpretation of local. So we found out that they were purchasing a line of products that was processed in the state, but was not, the animals themselves were not sourced from Vermont. And we kind of, in conversation, said, that's not really the spirit of the local definition for beef products, for meat products specifically. And so they really took that to heart and tried to find a kind of a supply chain solution to that. And they developed this beef program with a distributor, Black River Meats. And actually now the beef product is coming from Vermont dairy cull cows, which is addressing kind of an issue that our dairy industry had of, there were a lot of farms sending animals out of state to get processed and getting fairly low prices for that. And so now they have a much more kind of not premium market for those cull cows, but a much better kind of price point for those animals, and there's more kind of quality controls around it. So kind of just a good, I think, example of how this relationship has really evolved with Sodexo, and it's been just a really interesting process to see, how transparent they actually have been with us and receptive to our feedback and input. And I think it's encouraging for sure. I think, there was, on the first webinar, there was a question about some skepticism of like, how do you work with a company like Sodexo that values-wise might be doing some things that are that may be contrary to what we're trying to accomplish in local food development. So I think this is actually a good case of where we've gained some access and some influence, and they've been in turn really good partners and open to what we have to say. And just just to mention too that 2013 forum kind of gave a good model for our healthcare providers, and so a similar kind of forum was conducted in 2013. The focus there with healthcare was more with distributors and kind of sending a strong signal to them that they had a demand for local products and they wanted more transparency from their distributors about how to procure it. And a lot of developments kind of came out of that process, and actually FINE was a part of this, Healthcare Without Harm, our agency of agriculture. And there was a real group of leaders within our healthcare system and also in New Hampshire as well, and some other states that have continued from that point on to do some really amazing things within the healthcare system. But again, I think kind of the really important piece is that having a motivated buyer who can convey a strong signal to distributors it is, I think, a really critical component, and that's where institutions, I think, are huge, is that because they have strong sort of a values-based approach to what they're doing, is that carries a lot of weight in the market, in kind of the marketplace, and kind of can shift things. And that shift is then not only, because they're working with distributors, is not only influencing access for local producers to institutions, but the wholesale market in general. Because once they're onboarded with a distributor, that distributor is also servicing many other different types of accounts. So that, yeah, having a champion buyer is really essential. And then we've also kind of compiled a lot of these results and findings. We had a report that came out kind of about these opportunities and barriers to increasing local food procurement. And I think the big kind of takeaways from this, the second bullet there, local food purchases are primarily facilitated by partnerships with external organizations. So whether that's K through 12, our farm to school network is critical to influencing food procurement decisions at our schools and helping food service do that successfully. The colleges, with the Sodexo example, the advisory committee now is very impactful there. And then while local food can require more labor, there's just this halo effect that actually motivates and brings, I think, a lot of morale to the actual staff who are preparing food in our institutions. Some other things are just, I kind of mentioned the forum piece is just, bringing people together is across the supply chain is a really important factor here of developing relationships. Institutions that are sharing menus and kind of ways in which they can increase their procurement through menu design, sharing those best practices is huge. A big thing oftentimes kind of to start is focusing on this, are there items where there's 100% of it can be provided by a local provider, just to get kind of the foot in the door, get them used to procuring local. And I'm going to wrap up here. So, facilitate advanced planning communications with producers is a big piece, because oftentimes, addressing kind of supply inconsistencies is something that institutions are worried about, but also that they can provide that security in purchasing, that's important. And then another thing is just, kind of getting creative where you can incorporate local foods into institutions. So our colleges have, for instance, catering and retail outlets, and that's where maybe some of the more premium products can enter in and help them in turn kind of subsidize, in essence, some other types of local purchasing for their dining halls, because they're making greater margins off of those catering and retail pieces. And I'll just end with here quickly that the key challenges for institutions, particularly at K through 12, is that at least in the US and Vermont, school food programs and staff are often treated outside of the school budget and like the institution itself kind of culturally. And so not being seen as kind of, an essential component of the educational institution. So a lot of times those programs have to be self-sufficient without accessing kind of the general school budget, which creates, I think, a very cost-conscious model. dining operations, it's one thing to kind of buy local food. It's another thing to market it effectively. And so that's an area that's always, I think we're always kind of keen in on. The seasonal aspects of food service is a challenge for a temperate kind of place like Vermont, where production, summer really is that big influx, and that's when schools are not in service. And then also just the labor component there is that, staff, there's a lot of changeover, and so it's hard to kind of institute a culture and certain practices that are consistent over time. Shifting dietary needs, the kind of synthetic meat movement is really strong among students, and distributors have responded to that, and that's happening while we're trying to promote sustainable local meat production. So there's some challenges there to think about. And then just the heavy reliance on wholesale distribution is that, the institutions are very reliant on distributors, and that is not always a transparent or accessible system to our local producers. So that's also where our food hubs have become one kind of, trying to address that market failure, particularly at the K through 12 level of servicing our K through 12 schools. And so that's just something that continues to present some challenges that keeps me awake at night. So I'll end it there. That's my time, and hopefully touched upon some themes that Peter will further elaborate on as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jake. You covered an amazing amount of ground in a short space of time and did it with absolute aplomb. Thank you. There's a number of questions for you in the chat that perhaps you can pick up on and expand on some of the themes that you touched on there. But now we'll go straight over to Peter if you're able to stop sharing, Jake, and Peter can take over.
All right. Is that showing up on your screens?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, good. Well, it's great to be here. Jake, that was a great introduction and segue to my comments. I must say, from looking at the chat and looking over some of the materials about sustain earlier, it's amazing the alignment of the issues that you're dealing with in the supply chain, despite the fact that we're across the world from each other, and Jake and I are ready for nightcaps and you're all having your morning coffee. But I'm really excited to engage with you and think about sharing some of what we've been doing with Farm to Institution New England. So let's see, make sure this goes down. There we go. So just a little bit about Farm to Institution New England, or FINE. We're the backbone of a 6-state network of nonprofit, public and private companies working together to transform our food system in New England by working to increase the amount of good local food served to our region's institutions. Our vision is, I think, a lot like yours, to find an equitable and just food system that provides access to healthy and abundant food for all New Englanders, and is defined by sustainable and productive land and ocean ecosystems. Just a little bit about the network. So we work with K through 12 schools, campuses, college and university campuses, healthcare facilities, and some other institutions, including correctional facilities more recently. We do a lot with the dining staff, folks focused on sustainability, and the food service management companies like Sodexo that Jake was talking about. Obviously, are focused on the farmers and fishermen who are producing the food, and the processors, distributors, and food hubs who get the food to the institutions. But along with them, there are a lot of other entities at the institutions who are really critical partners, from the business side to the education side, research, students, campus farms. And then throughout society, there's other players, those working with the farmers and fishermen to work on their strategies to reach the institutional markets, and then funders and government folks, other businesses, nonprofits, et cetera. So it's a pretty extensive network that we are involved with. That's going backwards. This is good. All right, so in terms of some of the things that we do, we focus our work for the network in sort of 3 buckets of what we call services to support the network, specific programs that we're leading in these communities of practice, where we bring together peers of folks who are really the best experts to help each other. So we do events and trainings, a lot of communication work, research and metrics. We focus specifically on the college and university sector, and more so now with the prisons and jails as well. And then we do work within the public policy realm and with food service management companies, like as Jake was talking about with Sodexo. And then these communities of practice that I mentioned. So just to take a step back, and this may seem elementary, but for us, farm to institution is really the infrastructure, the processes, the supply chain relationships and policies that enable food to get from the producers to the institutions. And then the next question we often are asked is, why focus on the institutions? Traditionally, I've talked a lot about how institutions provide a diverse and a stable market for farmers and fishermen in the region. A lot of the direct markets, the farm stands, the CSAs, the farmers markets are becoming a little bit saturated. So the institutions provide a whole other set of buyers for those products. And they have traditionally been quite stable. They don't go away. They are sometimes seasonal, but what they buy from year to year is consistent. Now with COVID, that's been turned on its head a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But as Jake alluded to, beyond being buyers, institutions are also really important anchors in our communities from so many perspectives. And at least in New England, they also interact with a lot of people. About 3.7 million of the 14 million people in New England, about a quarter of the population here are students, employees, patients, or in some way spend time at institutions on a pretty regular basis. I should also probably say why we focus on a regional basis. Why New England? New England is the 6 states in the Northeast, and 3 of the states, Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, are really where most of the food is produced. And the bulk of the population is in the 3 lower states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So there's a food shed amongst the 6 states, and it makes sense to think about it as a region. Also, so many of the businesses that bring food to institutions or serve them don't stop at the state lines, but work on a regional basis. And we have quite a culture of collaboration in the region that really offers the potential to do some things collectively. As I mentioned, these are the sectors: college and university, K through 12, hospitals, and the correctional facilities are what we focus on by institutions. And so the next question is, like, how's it going? Our surveys show that colleges in the region are buying about 21.5% of their food from local sources. And that's either in-state or states proximate to them for the most part, or in the region. Hospitals are about 16% or 15%. Schools are 16%. We don't yet have data for the correctional facilities. I would note that this is higher than what the local procurement is for the region as a whole. And I think there's some interesting questions that probably get to why that's possible. From a dollar perspective, these are the amounts that are being spent on local food. And this is just from institutions that have responded to surveys. So it's actually likely to be quite a bit higher than that. In terms of what institutions are buying, it sort of runs the gamut. Some things in greater percentages and some where there's more challenges. And there are clearly barriers. So these are some barriers that have been brought to our attention by the institutional procurement people themselves. So costs and price point, availability on a consistent basis, the ability to get all the needs for meals from one source, the off-season availability, sometimes consistency and quality of both supply and quality. And then this issue of sort of delivery and distribution logistics. In general, institutions like to get all their stuff from one source. So having lots and lots of different deliveries and invoices is a barrier in and of itself. From the producer's side, the farmers and the fishermen, the concerns are not that different. They're worried about getting a good enough price, if their volumes will be sufficient, the seasonality, food safety requirements can be stricter from institutions than they are from other retail outlets at times. And are institutions interested in their products? I think one of the most important things about this slide is that the dark green bar are the producers who aren't selling to institutions but are thinking about it. And the light green are the ones who are already selling. So in general, there's sort of a perception of those who aren't in the game that it's really a much bigger challenge than those who are doing it. And so that's something that we've been working to break that perception barrier down. So COVID, I know you guys are doing a whole lot better than we are, but it's been a real game changer, particularly for the college and university sector that sent so many students home, and this year has so many students working or studying virtually. So before, really, the college and universities were the sector with the most procurement, highest percentage, and the sort of the easiest logistics, whereas the school procurement is much more challenging from a regulatory perspective, and hospitals have other sort of specialty food concerns. COVID has also, though, created some opportunities in innovation. We're seeing that local suppliers are stepping up to meet the demand and sometimes taking over from larger suppliers. There's a lot of new partnerships that developed in the region, including food access organizations, the charitable food system, restaurants, co-ops, as well as the traditional institutional partners. There's a lot of creativity and innovation that's happening. I just want to point you, this is something that we can share later, but all the data that I'm referring to is available at this dashboard. And you can click on any of these squares and get the reports and sort of dive in to see where the information comes from if you're so inclined. And that we have a national metrics collaborative on farm to institution that right now has 30 of the 50 states represented by over 100 people who are studying farm to institution. And I'll go out on a limb and say we'd love to have some international partners as well. They're looking to develop some standard indicators and metrics for looking at the impact of institutional sales on farmers as well as the rest of the supply chain. And there's a lot of great information on their site that's just been launched. It's a great initiative. So going forward, I would say that, you know, over the last 10 or 15 years, the farm to institution movement has changed a lot, and I think it is really continuing to change. The focus on local is being expanded to include sustainable and climate issues, just and equitable treatment of workers throughout the supply chain, culturally relevant foods, humanely produced foods, nutrition. And along with that is sort of the question of like, how do you measure how well we're doing on these things? In New England, we are setting a target of getting 30% of the food produced or consumed by institutions by 2030 to be from the region, which would add another $2.3 billion in annual spending on local food each year, or over that 10-year period. And in addition to the local, we're really focusing, how do we measure the foods as nutritious and just and equitable and those other values that I mentioned. So that is very much of a work in progress. We're working with some national partners, the Real Food Challenge on the university sector, Good Food Purchasing, which is focused on municipalities and their institutions, and Healthy Food and Healthcare, Healthcare Without Harm, who have are working together in a several-year project to set some new standards on all these different value areas. So just in wrapping up, just to highlight some priority strategies that we see are really critical to focus on in the next decade or so. So there's a lot of policy levers that focus on institutional procurement that we think are really important. Can change the rules to allow not just buying the cheapest food, but having local preference. And a lot of states have done that. Support for farm to school programs. Vermont was one of the first in the nation to have really ambitious farm to school grants to municipalities to have coordinators and buy food and get equipment to make that those programs succeed. And then reimbursement policies where funds are actually given to the schools based on the percentage of the local food that they're buying. New York State just passed a law where they have $10 million a year, and reimbursement to the schools goes up from 6 cents to 30 cents if they buy 30% of their food from New York providers. Vermont's looking at some similar legislation, as well as Maine and some other states around the country. And I'm not sure how comparable that is to the school food system in Australia, but it's something that we're seeing has the potential to really drive greater public expenditures. And Jake was talking a lot about the food service management companies and really diving into the details of those contracts with those companies to increase the amount of procurement they buy. There's some real barriers. They often have these huge contracts with vendors, and their institutions are required to buy over 80% of their food from those vendors. But there's ways to make amendments there. And through getting into the request for proposal process, which is what happened in Maine after the Vermont model, Maine was able to switch their vendor and require that they commit to buying 20% Maine food by 2025 and hire a local coordinator and track and share that information more widely. And then lastly, forward contracting. Making those agreements between the institutions and producers, in the winter before the growing season, and in some cases providing additional resources to help the producers meet the demand. There's a hospital in Vermont that helped buy greenhouses and some equipment and processing tools for growers so that they would be able to meet the demand of the hospital. And the largest food service operation at a college in the country is UMass Amherst, University of Massachusetts, with just 45,000 meals a day. And they've teamed up with some local chicken growers and actually provided them with some of the capital and infrastructure to help them scale up to start to meet their need. So yeah, that was a lot. Zoom burnout is challenging, but as a form of relief, I want to invite you all to the next Farm to Institution Summit this April. It'll be on 3 Thursdays, the same way you've been doing these forums. We're going to have lots and lots of sessions, virtual field trips, networking opportunities. We have people from all across the country who come to this event. It happens every 2 years. Since it's virtual, it's very easy for you folks to join, and hope to see some of you there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter. And it's great to have been able to take up the connection again with Fine. We were in touch with you 2.5 years ago in the context of an initiative coming out of New South Wales, the RDA in the Orange region, the central west of New South Wales, and a couple of your colleagues very generously were part of the forum back then in May 2018. And yeah, it's fantastic to see the work you're doing, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, your time, this morning, our time. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go straight to Leah now. Talks a bit about what her Churchill Fellowship is about. Leah.
Thanks so much. I'll just share my presentation, and sorry that the screen isn't how we might perhaps like it. What great presentations they were for me. I'm totally inspired by what you're doing in the US. And it's great to hear it firsthand from you. So I'll just launch straight in because we've only got 10 minutes. Can you see my screen okay? Can you see now the outline screen?
We just see your screen, Leah. It's good. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So what I wanted to run through was why I think local food procurement for institutions is important, a little bit about what we've been doing in Tasmania in the last couple of years, and then also just wrap up with what we're looking to in the future. So I kind of laughed when I was doing a run through of this morning. This is like a, you know, the list for cranky old women who are interested in food systems. I really want us to change our food system, and at the moment it's very dominated by the agricultural policy, and we're very preoccupied with trade. And so I think local food procurement allows us to consider a scaled up disruption. Otherwise, things won't change in the policy environment. Institutions in Tasmania alone prepare hundreds of thousands of meals every week, so the economics of the opportunity is quite significant. And we need our Tasmanian food system to be more resilient, as in more self-reliant, and be ready for future pandemics and crises. I mean, we've so seen that very, very clearly this year. And currently, we're really laggards, and it's time for us to reframe our system so that they're about eaters as well. The good news is that I'm not a lone ranger on this. There are lots of other people in Tasmania that are interested in relocalising our food systems. In the last couple of years, I've spoken with a lot of wholesalers who would love to source more locally produced food because it's fresher, it has a better shelf life, and it doesn't require a chemical treatment. For people living outside of our state, you might not realise that we have a very strong biosecurity system, which I totally support. But when fresh fruit and vegetables come into our state from somewhere else, they do receive a treatment which shortens the shelf life. Tasmanian producers want to sell more in Tasmania. Sandy Murray, who's on the line today, did some great research a few years ago and found out that it's not only small-scale producers that want to sell into Tasmania. All scales of producers do, and it's more about a mindset rather than the size of the business. When you speak to people in kitchens, whether it's in hospitality or in institutions, they'd also like to showcase and incorporate more local produce onto menus. And of course, Tasmanians would like to eat more. Everybody would like to eat more Tasmanian food. That's a pretty universal thing. And one of the ways that we've seen that this year is through a great survey that was done by the University of Tasmania, where they asked Tasmanian students a series of questions, and 62% of them prefer to eat Tasmanian food, which is really great. So as Nick mentioned, I did receive a Churchill Fellowship, and I was intending to travel in May and June of this year to the US, Canada, Denmark and Sweden, and in fact Vermont and the areas that Peter was talking about were on my list of places to visit. And I was going to explore approaches used by government, business and institution to lever food system change through local food procurement. So of course that trip was postponed, but I hadn't actually been waiting just on that. I had actually, through my work, been quite fortunate to be learning more about the opportunity of procurement here in Tasmania. So in the first quarter of 2019, at that time I was working for Eat Well Tasmania, and we received a small grant from the Public Health Tasmania. Many thanks to them for their support. And what we did was deliver an applied research approach project, exploring roadblocks and opportunities for increasing local food procurement by institutions in Tasmania. There were some really great outcomes from this. We certainly learned quite a lot. Some of the significant outcomes were around a couple of rapid reviews that were undertaken, which looked at tools and approaches that had been used. We looked at case studies of success, and then also wanted to quantify what the impacts on regional food economies and access to healthy food were when you start to relocalise your food systems. We delivered a collaborative pilot project on the UTAS campus in Launceston, and that was informed by these reviews. We produced some collateral for a campaign to promote the opportunity of local procurement, including a video with industry players. And of course, there was a pitch to government. The couple of key things that really stood out for me in the rapid reviews were, I mean, I've been a fan of this approach of relocalising regional food systems, but when we started to look at some of the case studies, it really was quite remarkable what could be achieved if you shifted your focus from only focusing on trade to looking at creating more regional and economic activity. So when you relocalise, you might create up to 4 times as much regional activity, up to 3 times as many jobs. I mean, these are great stats, and certainly these are the things that we need to be focused on in our COVID recovery. So I think, and that's why my hypothesis is that local food procurement, its time has certainly come. There were lots of other great outcomes that you can expect from this sort of relocalisation as well. And my colleague Julie's going to be speaking about school attendance and concentration a little bit later, which is great. For people who would like to see the rapid reviews, they're not exhaustive, but we did what we could with the resources we had. You can find them through the Eat Well Tasmania website. There's a page on local food procurement there, and there's also another link there in that slide. I'll share these into the chat after my presentation on a publication in Canadian Food Studies that was all about local food procurement and is really great reading. So the couple of things that were really key learning from the UTAS pilot was to start engagement with the key stakeholders early. So we did that even when we were designing what the project was going to look like. And it was really about building an understanding of the operating environment. So big thanks to Tanya Harvey, who is in the Infrastructure Services and Development area of the university. So she actually manages the contracts with the food service providers. So the food service provider, Chartwells, they're a large international company. We spoke with them very early in the piece too. What made that first conversation easier was actually being able to talk to them about examples of how Chartwells was doing this kind of work in other institutions internationally, and actually that helped smooth the way quite significantly. So it then didn't feel like we were trying to achieve something totally unique or even a little bit kooky. And certainly talking with the suppliers, and we did focus in this project on fruit and veg, also really grounded our sort of understanding in some operational issues. All of those early conversations mean that we had increased trust, really strong buy-in, and also we weren't going off on tangents that weren't going to be helpful. The other thing, of course, that was really significant was leadership. The project team included, a range of champions from across the University of Tasmania. I mean, every good project needs to build a good team. I'm very grateful to the people that came along for the ride. The other thing is, as much as possible, I would recommend that if you want to do this kind of work, that you align with goals of other key activities that are going on in the institution that you're targeting. We were quite lucky that the University of Tasmania does a student sustainability survey every 2 years, and because of this project that we were running, Sandy Murray, my colleague, was able to get 6 food-related questions into that survey. That's where that earlier figure that I quoted of 62% of students preferring local came from. And the other thing was that it also was a good reminder to us to consider that there will be all sorts of barriers for people participating in local food procurement, the businesses I'm referring to now. And one of the things we identified quite early in the piece was that small-scale producers supplying to the suppliers or aggregators into the university would probably need to have some retraining around food safety and quality requirements. So how are we going now? Well, we're looking to the future. Our broad call to action still remains that what we need in Tasmania to take up this opportunity is we need leadership. We need a stronger buy local strategy. We do have one. And we also need some resourcing. What's been interesting in both Jake and Peter's presentations today is to reflect on the fact that this work has to be somebody's job. It won't happen just as a consequence because we want it to. The Premier's Economic and Social Recovery Advisory Council released an interim report not long ago. It has 4 recommendations around using government procurement to support the COVID recovery. That's great. The Premier's Health and Wellbeing Advisory Councils developed a range of recommendations to deliver a food policy for Tasmania and a range of projects, including one for increasing local food procurement. This is under consideration. And then our bright shining light at the University of Tasmania is there's a campus food strategy being considered. They're currently conducting an audit on the food environment in campus. And there's also a new Associate Director of Sustainability that's including progressing campus procurement within his responsibilities. So yes, we do have some opportunities to push forward. The other thing we need to continue to do is to be persistent, flexible and creative. And we just need to keep going because we're nowhere near the result we want at the moment. I just wanted to especially thank some of my colleagues who've been on the ride with me for the last couple of years here in Tasmania. I really appreciated your support and enthusiasm for the work that I'm trying to push. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Leah, and congratulations on your work and your leadership in Tasmania and the Churchill Fellowship. And it'll be a fantastic trip when you get to do it. And also congratulations on the work that you and your colleagues have been leading in Tassie. Okay, now we're going to hand over to Veronica Graham from the Victorian Department of Health, which is going to be fascinating to hear what you've got to share with us, Veronica, particularly as Victoria has been the state that's been most heavily impacted by COVID in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Great, terrific. Okay. So the title there is an interesting one. It's different from what was in the program. It's about how we use procurement in Victorian government as a lever for healthy change in Victoria. Thank you. And as I was introduced, I do work for the state government of Victoria in the prevention space. Next slide. Is that working? There you go. Is that better?
No, we're not seeing the next slide, Monica.
There you go. I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners from where we are meeting and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, before I get into the body of the action in what we're doing, very briefly in healthy procurement in Victoria, I do want to lay the foundation and mention we have 6 key pieces that allow us to do this work and leverage this work. 3 pieces of legislation, 2 government policies and 1 state support structure. So as I go for the next 10 minutes, listen out to when I mention them because they won't all come at the beginning. The first piece of legislation we have, which came into being in 2008 and is very familiar to Victorians, is the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. And as part of that act, it requires the Victorian government to set a public health and wellbeing plan for 4 years, every year for forever. So that's fantastic. We love the forever stuff. And the current one.
Veronica, sorry, just to interrupt. We're not seeing. I think you've moved forward in your presentation, but we're just still seeing your title slide.
I beg your pardon.
Yeah, you might have to jump out of the full screen mode, unfortunately, and just go through as Leah did.
Can you see it now?
No, we're still just seeing the title slide.
I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute. I do beg your pardon.
Sure.
I do lots of presentations. It's amazing how it still has problems. How is that? What are you seeing now?
Yes, we're now seeing the Health and Wellbeing Act slide. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you for your patience. Okay, in Victoria, for those that are interstate or international, the population of Victoria is 6.5 million. So when I speak about all of this, that's the population we're covering and thinking about. So we have the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. We also have another piece of, how's that? Oh gosh. We also have another piece of legislation which came into is the climate change legislation.
Yes. Yep.
Can you see that slide?
Yep.
Yes, great. This is fantastic because obviously food is related to climate change, and so we do think these are related. I'm not going to go on to the detail there. It's fairly new, and the first plan has just come out, so it's brand new, 2020. We've also just done a couple of months ago, which you can see on the left there, is guidance for local government on how they actually take the Climate Change Act and integrate it into their local government work. So it's an amazing resources there for you to access. And the third foundation piece, we have a whole of government Victorian social procurement framework. And it's actually a policy, and it requires every single government department, whether you're Treasury or Premier or Transport, to actually pay attention with your big procurement dollars and give primary consideration to purchasing in these 10 domains: Aboriginal communities, disability, and so on. Sustainability is there, disadvantage is there. So I'm not going to go over it, but there is that document for you to reference. So these are our foundation pieces. In addition, we have state policy, which is our healthy choices, which is about food and drink supply, and that's healthy food and drink supply. It's well known to many Victorians, and it covers all our major government settings: hospitals, health services, sport and rec, workplaces, and parks, state parks. And the other big infrastructure we have is through Nutrition Australia. We fund an advisory service, and that helps organisations to transform. So we have more than the policy, more than the legislation, but we have support. And yet again, those links are there for you to follow on later. So now let's get on to some of the action and how we've used government levers to make healthy procurement. First big one is the example we use in looking at healthy choices, healthy food and drink in our sport and rec. It's just a huge business in Victoria, as I'm sure it is everywhere. And we are very proud to say that we've worked over many years with our the Department of Sport and Rec in Victoria. And there is a lot of money that goes out through sport and rec consistently. So just for next year, there's another 68 million going out into sport and rec to either upgrade old facilities or retrofit or some new builds. And as part of the deal with that money, we have one of the tender specifications that they have to answer is how are they going to demonstrate healthy food and drink supply in those sporting settings. So for us, this is like the perfect way government can act when we use all our other partners and leverage off the work, and we complement, you know, healthy sport, healthy eating. So that's alive and well. We're doing quite well there, as many of you will be aware. The other big piece of information in terms of our farmers and our growers and our producers, our Premier right at the end of 2018, he made a public commitment, an election commitment, that said we are going to make sure that the food in our public hospitals is fresh and healthy and wherever possible locally sourced to support our Victorian farmers and producers. Now, if you're in Victoria and if you want to eat a banana or a mango, they actually grow in Queensland. So we'll never get them from Victoria. So when we think about local, we have to be realistic about what actually grows in Victoria. But there is a lot of food grown in Victoria. It's actually a big food bowl. So there are about 327 hospitals and aged care facilities. The work that has been committed here has been finished, and those recommendations are still getting finalised at the moment. So they're not public yet. I know everyone's dying to know, because we do know we have done this. We do know, you know, how much is sourced from Victoria and so on. So keep an ear out for that one. As part of the health system here in Victoria, we have something called a Health Purchasing Victoria. It's an organisation, it's a statutory body, it's funded by government, but it sits outside of government. And it basically is where hospitals and health services purchase major things. And it's like a central buying point. And it's not just food, it's packaged food and fresh food, but it's also other products like you know, PPE and all sorts of in other, you know, light bulbs and a whole lot of things. So we're currently working, and the team, and I have to call out a big shout out to Kelly, Rita, Jess and Sharon. There's been a lot of work over the time, and we're currently as a team on all this work, but working to get the Healthy Choices specifications embedded into the Health Purchasing Victoria tender. So that when they go out to tender, which they do, I think, every 3 to 5 years, we'll be insisting on there has to be a low fat, low salt options, low salt simmer sauces example for hospitals and cafes to purchase. So that's a huge ticket item. And the other piece of legislation, the third piece of legislation that's pretty significant here, is we have a Improving Cancer Act legislation and the new cancer plan, which just came out a couple of months ago. We've been very busy in COVID, actually. We actually managed to get a target that 80% of our health services had to be meeting healthy choices by 2024. So that's another great piece. Nearly at the end, we also, of course, have a commitment for healthy choices for workplaces. And at the end of 2018, the Department of Health and Human Services did endorse this policy for the state, and you can get that's copy there. There are about 60 offices across Victoria government in terms of health and human services, and of course COVID did put a stop on that, but we are preparing to relaunch the policy implementation next year. That should be 2021, sorry. We're also looking to support the businesses and the social enterprises across the region to help them meet that healthy food procurement policy. So it's not just here's the policy, but we also say here's how we help you support it. And I think for us that's the most powerful way to work. And of course that policy, which is about healthy food, it's obvious now with our focus on climate change and our social procurement framework that we are looking to extend that policy to make it healthy and more sustainable food procurement. And our climate team, we've been working with our climate team and we've got a draft model and we're working up back-end guidance and we're looking at how we can make that a real thing going forward. And on that, I will say thank you. And that is it, everybody.
Amazing.
I think
Thanks
I'm under
very much.
time. I think
You
that was
are.
Thank you.
You did an amazing job, Veronica. Thank you very much indeed.
I'll stop sharing now.
Yes, that would be
Yes.
great. So look, we're just running a little bit behind time. So, but just in the interest of kind of like breaking up the webinar, we will take a few minutes just to have a bit of a chat and deal with a couple of questions that haven't already been answered in the written form. So thanks to Jake and Peter and others who've been conversing in the chat and answering questions. I think there was one that came up, and I think I actually put this to you, Jake, because you touched on it very briefly towards the end about the logistics piece and how local food actually gets to institutions from farms. And you mentioned food hubs, and I was kind of interested because that's an emerging sector here. It's just sort of like starting to get off the ground, but I know it's much more established over on your side of the oceans. I wonder if you might just want to, you or Peter, maybe say a little bit about food hubs and what they are and what they do and what role they play in enabling, facilitating, the movement of greater volumes of produce into institutions like universities, schools, hospitals, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of food hubs has a very broad definition. There's many forms that it can take. And I'd say in Vermont, the major piece has been, kind of functioning as providing this aggregation role. So, it could be shared storage or a central location that brings, kind of volume, and then providing kind of a distribution component. So then, delivering that food to institutions or grocery stores, and kind of fulfilling that sort of marketing and logistics piece that a lot of small farms individually struggle to do. And so a lot of our food hubs, I think, kind of on the distribution side, started with K through 12. Finding that a lot of local schools were having trouble kind of navigating with their wholesale providers, procuring local, and knowing farms in their community that they, could reach out and touch, and yet weren't able to bring into the into the cafeteria, kind of the food hubs fulfilled kind of this, kind of almost a market failure, if you will, in kind of bridging that gap and providing access for those kind of ultra local producers into the school system. And so that's, a lot of our food hubs kind of started in that space and then began to evolve from there. So we've got some that do sell to then now hospitals and universities, and now have also branched out into retail. And yeah, so I think it's really kind of this bridging this logistical gap that a lot of small producers find difficult, and also in the food hubs also can fulfill kind of vendor requirements of institutions, which, in fulfilling that, they can then provide access to many more producers than if those producers were to try to fulfill those obligations individually. So it also creates efficiencies for the colleges and schools themselves as well. So there's kind of the kind of reciprocal relationship that occurs. So that's and our food hubs have been a big part of our network, and our Ag and Distribution Working Group was led by Richard Burkfield for a number of years, who is the executive director of Food Connects, which is in Brattleboro, Vermont, which is the southeastern part of the state. And so, it's been kind of this learning journey together, where a lot of what we're exploring is a lot of oftentimes issues and barriers that our food hubs are encountering as they kind of develop and evolve as distributors themselves.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And Peter, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that. There was a question here about do food hubs actually, can they be a driver of increasing local food sales? And I guess just quantitatively, has there been a discernible increase in the number of food hubs and their volume and the emergence of a discernible food hub sector in the United States over the last decade or so?
It's a good question. I mean, one thing is certain is that food hubs almost exclusively deliver local food. So to the extent that they are in the supply chain, they're increasing the local food. By and large, the amount of food that they're delivering is relatively small. So in terms of seeing any kind of real spike in terms of the overall local food percentages as a result of them, on some individual institutions' case, I think that is true. Yeah, and the real key, I think, is to do it takes a little bit of extra effort on the part of the institution. So where there's a demand and where there's some relationships, the food hubs can actually do, as Jake said, improve that sort of efficiency of delivery. And that's not insignificant. There's a lot of institutions that want that local food. And the food hubs for certain products at certain times of the year are the best way to get it. And there's a lot of effort going in to try and make that more efficient. There's efforts around the whole country looking at those issues. And I think the jury's still out in terms of the numbers, the significance of the food hubs in terms of changing the local procurement situation. However, they're definitely changing the character of it. And so they're introducing a lot of new food and exposure, and those relationships are being built. So the jury's still a little bit out in terms of the overall impact, though.
Yeah,
Okay.
as a sort of a number, our food hubs are around, I think, combined like 4 million in sales, and that's like five or so entities. So to Peter's point, that's a very small percentage of like overall food movement that's happening, and local food movement that's happening. And also I think some of our food hubs have themselves questioned whether institutions are really like a market for their producers based on some of the issues that Peter was talking about, whether it's price or just kind of the fit for them in maintaining kind of the margins that they need to maintain back to producers and themselves to be and oftentimes they're not sort of self-sustainable from a financial and like operations perspective. So they are supported through philanthropy. So there's also just that question of, you know, how to sustain them operationally if they can't kind of find a financial model that works kind of in the, you know, in the market kind of economy.
Okay, well, sorry, Peter, you wanted to add something else?
Oh, just that moderately processed food is a sector of food that's actually starting to increase in the margin for things like, you know, cheese or yogurt as opposed to fluid milk, or sliced and frozen carrots and broccoli and blueberries as opposed to fresh, provides a real advantage to the institutions that have challenges in the kitchen with labor and equipment sometimes to take fresh whole product. So that's an area that there's a fair bit of work being done to see how the food hubs as aggregators can also combine with the processors to get local food to institutions.
Great. Okay. Thank you both very much. Well, we'll now move on to the second part of the webinar, our next final three presenters, and then we'll hopefully have time for another 15 minutes or so. But encourage again to continue putting comments and questions and sharing links as you've all been doing in the chat. So now I'm going to introduce our next three presenters. First, Tim Milsom, the former CEO of the Fremantle Chamber of Commerce and Industry, of the Burubalaji and Talaniji Aboriginal Corporation, and apologies if I've mispronounced that, Tim, and current Executive Officer of the Noongar Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Tim owns a number of successful businesses and has been awarded both local and international awards in innovation and export through his UK interests. After Tim, we'll hear from Sophie Lamond. Sophie's in the final year of her PhD at the Melbourne School of Government, at the Melbourne Law School at Melbourne University. She is the director of Fair Food Challenge, an NGO which empowers young people to transform campus food environments and take an active role in policy development. Her doctoral research, considers how institutions develop and implement comprehensive food policies that create healthier, more sustainable and equitable food environments. And finally, we'll hear from Julie Dunbaven. Julie's had a rewarding career in teaching, health promotion and health promoting schools at government, health promotion in the general practice setting and as a canteen manager at a primary school. And for the past 10 years, she's been executive officer at the Tasmanian School Canteen Association. So very warm welcome. Thank you to you all. And now I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much. Again, just a quick introduction to myself. I'm Tim Milsom. I'm the CEO of the Noongar Chamber of Commerce and Industry here in WA. The Noongar Chamber is the first Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce in Western Australia. And we started about 3 years ago. We've got just over 400 members. And I suppose if I give you a little bit of my background, I'm an entrepreneur, got businesses in the UK, which I started when I was 21. I'm now considerably much older than that, and I still own those same businesses. They've been very successful. I came to Australia in 2013, and I was asked to actually head up a business, teaching business at TAFE, which I did for a couple of years. And then I got asked to be the CEO of the Fremantle Chamber of Commerce. Fremantle is a city in WA. It's the second largest city. And it's the oldest Chamber of Commerce of Industry in Australia. I then got recruited to go and work for an Aboriginal corporation called the Burubalaji Thalangi. And this is in the Pilbara, and it was on land that Chevron were mining Gorgon and Wheatstone, two huge multi-billion-dollar projects for gas. And Chevron were finding it very difficult to engage with Aboriginal suppliers and I felt that I could probably help them fill that gap. So I've been working alongside major corporates over here in WA to try to actually break down the barriers for Aboriginal supply. So not just in food, but in business in general. So that's a little bit of background about myself. So and the reason, you know, I'm called a Wadjala, which is a white fella, and pretty unusual for a Wadjala to be heading up an Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce. But I'm absolutely honoured to be in this role and making a huge difference in a very short time. One of the things that we've got over in Western Australia is an Aboriginal procurement policy. And that began in 2018, and it's just being reviewed now, 2021. It started off at 1% of contracts to be spent with Aboriginal supply, and then year 2, 2%, and now it's 3%. So 3% of contracts. Contracts represent anything of value over $50,000. So, you know, if a government is putting out 10,000 contracts per annum, 3% of those need to be spent with Aboriginal business, and they can't be counted as a contract unless the value is 50,000 and above. So, you know, we're lucky to have a policy. As I say, up until 2018, we didn't have a policy, and there was no way of measuring what we were actually spending with Aboriginal supplies. So we've just been conducting a review on behalf of the Department of Finance here in WA. I would mention that Noongar Chamber is, or Noongar Nation is the largest Aboriginal community in Western Australia, and it's got a huge land mass running pretty much south of Geraldton all the way down to Esperance. So it's a huge mob, and yeah, lots of land opportunities and food opportunities that we're looking at the moment. So like I say, the policy is 3% at the moment. We're pushing government to extend that either by a percentage for 2022 or the value of contracts is something that we are speaking to government about, whether in actual fact we could actually say, could government be forced into spending 3% of the spend rather than 3% of the contracts. We've got a very good Aboriginal leader here in Ben Wyatt, who's the Minister for Finance and Aboriginal Affairs and Land. He's about to retire, but he's been instrumental in this policy. We congratulate him on the policy, and again, the policy itself is overachieving, if you like. It's actually looking at up to 4.5% of spend from government to Aboriginal business. So again, we're looking at making some recommendations. One of the real barriers for Aboriginal business to supply major contractors and government is the pre-qualification requirement. A pre-qual over here is pretty arduous to get through, and a lot of the Aboriginal businesses probably just haven't got the mechanisms and capabilities to comply with the pre-quals. So again, we're trying to ask government to allow us to go out there into Aboriginal communities, build the capability of the Aboriginal communities in sort of, especially in land management at the moment. It's a huge topic over here. The Aboriginal people obviously have been on this land for 65,000 years and have gone through many of these experiences we're going through at the moment, i.e. COVID-19 and climate change. And they've managed this country in a very unique way of based around protocol and hierarchy and land understanding and actually understanding the land is a real powerful part of the culture over here. One of the things that we're again looking at doing with, instead of being a reactor, which is, you know, the Aboriginal space has always been a bit of a reactor. Government tends to sort of say, this is what you need, and this is, you know, and they feed it down into the Aboriginal community. We're suggesting that we actually become an influencer, and that is having a tremendous effect on some huge major infrastructure programs over here in WA. And government are actually listening for the first time to the First Nation people. So one of the things that we're saying is, well, let's actually be part of the project team. When a huge infrastructure project is on the table, rather than you feeding us down, you know, oh, we need supplies for such and such. Let's actually sort of see what we can influence. So one of the things we've just done is a big program called Alchemos that it's almost a new city we're creating in the northern suburbs. A new train station going in and lots of housing and infrastructure going around that area. And we sort of said, well, what's going to be needed to, you know, sustain this project? And they said, well, you know, we're going to need lots and lots of trees. And we said, okay, well, what about us creating a nursery? And you giving us an order for the trees that is required for the project. And we will grow those trees, and then by the time the project's built, the trees will be actually larger saplings and be able to use and fulfill the requirements for those contracts. So, and government again are being very receptive in that way of thinking. And again, it's remarkable that we're at, you know, within 3 years of setting this up. That we have got that influence in government today, that we're able to actually sit on the panels and talk about, you know, legacy for Aboriginal community and supply and land management. We've also got a large infrastructure program coming up called the Bunbury-Adder Ring Road, which is a $880 million contract down south. And we're suggesting again that there's a real opportunity for waste management built around Aboriginal engagement, such as FOGO and recycling of plastics, recycling of glass and construction and demolition. And again, government are listening, you know, so for the first time, I suppose, an Aboriginal-owned organisation is having an influence on huge procurement opportunities and infrastructure development here in WA. And yeah, I mean, I would just like to congratulate our government on the fact that they have got that foresight to engage Aboriginal people and their culture and their values into these huge manufacturing infrastructure projects. That's pretty much it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. That's a hugely positive and encouraging story that you shared with us, and again, sort of echo your congratulations to the West Australian government in really showing that leadership and really getting behind the Noongar Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thanks very much for sharing all of that with us. Now going to hand straight over to Sophie. Sophie Lamond is going to talk to us about her research and work with Fair Food Challenge. Over to you, Sophie.
I'm not actually going to talk about that. Thanks, Nick. I'm going to talk about my research in the US and something institutional procurement, things that I found out about. Thanks, Nick, for the introduction earlier, and also greetings from Moreland. I'm here from the land of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded and that we have a lot of food systems work that could learn from our ancient traditions. So this year, I was lucky enough, I got back to Australia on the 28th of February, and some serendipitous occasion managed to complete 4 months of field work in the US, and my PhD research is looking at institutional foodscapes. So I'll just share my screen and so I can show you a little bit about the work that I've been doing, and I think answer some of the questions that have come up in the chat as well, because I think it's really difficult coming from Australia. Our experience of institutional food is incredibly different to the US. And I noticed in the chat a few people asking questions like, what does that mean? And I think I had a funny time as well in the States, because people kept sort of being like, well, you know, this thing. And I was like, no, the idea of eating at school just doesn't exist in Australia. And people were like, I don't understand what that means. And I was like, you just bring a sandwich. And, you know, we do have things like tuck shops and everything, but I think a lot of the reference points for institutional food are very, very different. So basically, I'm really just going to show you some photos from my magnificent adventures romping around the US and trying not to fall over in the snow. And just some of the insights. I can see Jake laughing there. Look, it's very cold. It's not good for an Australian. Yeah, just some of the insights that I gleaned, and really some of the gaps, I think, that really about this idea of translating this as international policy. So I suppose one of the fundamental questions in my research is what's a university for? You know, so we universities educate students, they conduct research, they run huge spaces with very large endowments, especially in the US. Some of the endowments are truly mind-watering, eye-watering, mind-blowing. And then there is this concept, and I think, Peter, you mentioned this idea of the anchor institution. So that's quite a thing coming out of the US, is like, well, you know, what you are spending all this money, you are doing all this research, how do you then contribute to the community you live in? And I think that's something that we could really take into our research going forward, is this idea of, you know, what are universities, or, you know, what are institutions, hospitals, prisons, doing for the communities that they live in? And it's my argument that all of these things can be leveraged to benefit the food system, whether that's educating future food system leaders like Nick is doing, and Kelly, who's here. I teach at the University of Melbourne, and I'm sure we all represent a lot of other places where that kind of work is happening. The research we're doing, we just heard about Sandy doing some really amazing research in UTAS. A lot of us have either we use campuses up until, you know, this year, and are all citizens and eaters. So we have a lot of leverage points in some sense. Just a bit of a sense for Australians who come from this very, very different system. I think we've probably got like 25 universities in the whole of Australia. So there's nearly 4,500 higher education institutions in the US. That comprises 19.6 million students, which is a good chunk of our population, which is sort of hard to conceive of. I think with the staff, it probably is our population, employing up to nearly 4 million staff. And the majority of them are private institutions. So, you know, students are paying money to go to them. So that whole landscape is a very different snapshot to what we see in Australia. There's $48.9 billion estimated. No one is actually really sure. The USDA is like, we think it's about this much. So $48.9 billion is just on food and universities, just on food. And that was mentioned a little bit about these actors like Aramark, Sodexo and Compass. I could give you a whole other presentation critiquing those guys and student activism around a lot of that work, but it's another conversation maybe Jake and I can have later, as it was mentioned. And then, so 41% externally and 52% are operated by the universities, as in university paid staff. They cook and prepare and deliver that food every day. So there's a lot more institutional control as opposed to Australia, where our majority model is there's a cafe, buy a coffee if you want, don't if you don't want to. I think it's also just important to mention, it's not directly what we're talking about, but the hunger situation is really a critical part of this idea of changing cost models in higher education. Research has suggested that up to 43.5% of US students suffer food insecurity, which is really a lot more than the national average. And that's including, you know, emergence of a lot more first generation college students, people going to college much later and working and having competing priorities in families. Student support is worth a lot less than it used to be relative to the cost of living. There's a bunch of reasons, but I think it's just important to point out that the wicked problem at the heart of this really is that institutions have less per unit of meal to spend on anything. There are more hungry students who have less money to spend and require more student support. And we also want to encourage fair wages. And the tension of those three things, I think, is really where institutions tend to fall down. They lean towards one or the other. They want to deal with basic needs and hunger. They want to deal with local procurement. It's very hard to sort of get into policy where you really are working properly and exhaustively to do those three things. And so one of the things I sort of am addressing in my own research is sort of this basic definition of what is a foodscape, which is a word that has been floating around in food studies research for some time, but is used sort of quite fluidly by whoever wants to use it. For me, I think it's a good term because it is quite flexible. And so we're not just looking at food goes in, food goes out, the material flows. We're also looking at the social and cultural ways that food is used, the exchanges and relationships that go on there, the programming, even things like activism. So it's not just about food in, food out. It really is a whole picture of food, hopefully. This is a map you can't really see because it's very large, but I just thought I'd show it to you to get a sense of, I've been mapping every activity I could find on a campus foodscape. So what I really want to demonstrate with this is not that you can't read the tiny writing for ants, but that the complexity of what is going on in a campus foodscape is a lot more than really has been accounted for in any literature so far. So that's everything from, you know, a composter to community cooking classes to harvest feasts to exactly farm to institution New England. So I'll just zoom in. You know, so this is basically the categories. If anyone wants to get into this in more detail, I can send you this because I'm really just racing through this in a short amount of time. But, you know, for example, we have things like local food, and this is zooming in on one section of that. So, you know, there's a huge amount of CSA boxes that go to campuses in the US, and that's the thing that we don't necessarily see much of in Australia. Farmers markets, really looking at the promotion of local food within institutional food service. And I think just my point for Australians is we don't really know what that is. So I just really wanted to show you, so I'll just skip past this. And this is another map that, once again, you can't really see, mapping all of the stakeholders in campus food systems. So Jake and Peter, fine is one of those points, but there's that many other organisations like you guys that are contributing to this ecosystem. So I think as an outsider, it's also really important to recognise that the complexity of the food movement in America is so much more complicated and diversified than it is here. So, for example, this is just certification, things like menus of change, issues that the Farm to Institution in New England's up here, but there's all of these other organisations as well. But I just wanted to show you some happy snaps. So not only are there people sort of going every day, someone asked, are people paying money? Yes, meal plans in the US are extraordinarily expensive. So students are paying several $1,000s a year for the privilege of going in and eating, and swiping for each meal takes that deduction off their meal plan. It splits between universities, some it's compulsory, some that it's not. It's a complicated thing, but I just really wanted to highlight. So this is, I think you mentioned, Peter, UMass Amherst, or maybe Jake, is one of the biggest providers of meals in the country. And so this is like, you walk in, they're literally like, our apples come from this guy, you know, this farm, you know. So the idea of local food promotion, I was surprised how pervasive it was in these kinds of spaces. This is an example from the University of Connecticut, which is basically me standing in the rain, really cold, taking pictures of this food truck, which is doing, you know, it does these pop-up food system kind of providers. And just some examples again of the same thing. So Harvard in Boston, you know, this messaging around local and fresh, Portland State University, Emory, and I featured those just because they are really a mix of public, private, Ivy League, you know, so this isn't just one example. And I think obviously what Fine's doing really has highlighted the New England area, which is probably the leader in this area. But I genuinely was surprised how much there was. I mean, you know, and I did select institutions in my study that are doing good things, but the pervasiveness of that local messaging, I think it was quite extraordinary to me. And, you know, just things like community gardens, obviously permaculture garden looks a bit different from its origins in northern beach, you know, north coast New South Wales to being in the snow in the middle of a Massachusetts winter through the University of Washington. So things like campus agriculture contribute to that local food catchment. And the teaching, this was a lecture I went to, there's Alice Waters and a chef just banging out a vegan meal in the middle of a lecture at Berkeley. So, you know, the food system education and the investment in that, I think, is a very different landscape as well, which is obviously aspirational, but important to remember that we are starting at a different baseline. I just wanted to include this as well, not to like oversell how great the American food system is, because all of this was there as well. And every time I mentioned to anyone in my interviews about, you know, challenging soda contracts, there was just this flat silence of we won't talk about it. There was absolutely no interest in divesting from corporate food. There was an interest to add in local food, but never ever an interest to truly tackle things like soda contracts, except in like 2 universities, which once again, hold up the presentation, but this isn't going anywhere. And obviously with food insecurity, some amazing projects, which I'm happy to talk more about if you're interested in contacting me around. So this is a basic needs pantry. So this is essentially a shop on the left here at the University of California, Berkeley. Any student can walk into and pick up their groceries without handing over a cent. This is a staff program at Harvard where staff groups are packaging up meals to go to local hunger bank, food banks. So yeah, just sort of looking at the way some of these things are connecting together to the broader food systems problems. I'm a bit over time, so just going to really quickly wrap up just saying, you know, a little bit of a reflection on Australia. We have a privatized food system, so we don't have a procurement manager where you can go and be like, hey, Greg, do you want to switch to local ham? That guy, like, or woman or person does not exist. One of the challenges I face doing projects in universities is there's no fridges, there's no rooms, there's nowhere to store stuff. If we were to aggregate food, everyone's like, what am I going to do with it? And it's very hard to do things if there is no storage or no infrastructure. We also have a big food security problem. No one is paying for this work inside universities. And often, and I just really wanted to highlight this because I feel like, you know, there's many of these people on this call, is it's often over-reliant on noisy champions like myself and Leah and Sandy and Nick going, hey, what about this thing? Which is fine, but that's not sustainable. If that person leaves, and the whole conversation can collapse really quickly. So it's not really sustainable policy advocacy. So we have some opportunities. Residential colleges do procurement. We've heard from some people about some opportunities around policies. I think one of the big things in Australian universities at the moment is the Victorian Social Procurement Framework is a really big opportunity. Getting student life programming back after getting people to COVID, I think, is an opportunity. There's obviously, as we can see demonstrated by this being here, there is more education, there's more interest, and there is increased collaboration. That's obviously really important. And obviously my final point is support students. They can get a lot done if they get the right help. Again, can talk about that at length at another time, but I think it really is, someone did mention before, you need students to really push the agenda at universities. Anyway, that was my quick and wild ride through institutional reflections, but looking forward to keeping this discussion going and collaborate. And I think just connecting together this sector more is where we have to go from here.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Sophie. That sounds like fantastic research. Congratulations, and looking forward to seeing, you know, publications and more presentations coming out of that, because it looks really, really important. And just echo what you're saying about students and vulnerability in Australia, through some informal chats with City of Melbourne and others. The level of food stress and food insecurity currently being experienced by international students in Melbourne is off the charts, apparently. So it's a really important issue that we need all to be advocating about and seeing much more emphasis and prioritisation of in terms of addressing it. But it seems like that message is getting through to the state government, which is great, as evidenced by Veronica being here today. So finally, I'm going to hand over to Julie to tell us about the work she's been doing with the school sector and canteens in Tasmania. Julie.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks for everyone for some amazing work so far. I'll just get to share my screen. I just need to go back. How do I go back? Oh. So I actually was very fortunate to get a Churchill Fellowship in 2018, and I travelled in October to December last year. Got home just in time on the 20th of December, so nearly a year ago. I investigated the factors that enable school lunch programs to impact positively on student health and wellbeing. And these are the countries that I visited. So I went to America, particularly to Chicago and Washington, DC, England, Scotland, Finland, Italy, France, and I finished up in Japan. So I saw some amazing examples of how these countries feed their children whilst they're at school. And some of the commonalities or the main findings were in relation to the pink circles, which I'll go through. And these were what I found were common through all schools, that all children were eating a school prepared lunch. There was a few exceptions there where students could still bring their lunch to school, but generally speaking, the school was providing the lunch for the children. All children got to sit down to eat for at least 20 minutes, and in France it was for an hour. In Australia, we're an eat and run, or eat on the run way of eating, and our children, if they're lucky, get 5 minutes to gobble down their food before they go out into the schoolyard. So that was a huge difference. I virtually only saw water as the preferred drink option and plain milk, but in America I obviously did see chocolate milk, which we have problems with or issues with in Australia around the flavoured milks available for children. I didn't see any confectionery options, and that is probably the case in most states in Australia, but in Tasmania we still have confectionery that can be sold at the school canteen, so we've got an issue there. I saw a skilled workforce who enjoy cooking for children. Whilst we've got some great canteen managers in Tasmania, I would say 70% of the canteen managers have no skill set in preparing food. So the food literacy is extremely low. And if we don't have a school workforce, then we can't actually change what's being prepared for children. I saw a pride in using local and seasonal produce wherever I went. I saw that school members and dietitians were heavily involved in menu planning, usually at a local government level, because they were in charge of schools in most countries that I went to. I did see a diverse food selection, both from a cultural and dietary perspective. I didn't see the same amount of food allergies and intolerances that we have in Australia. It was quite markedly lower in all the countries that I went to. I saw the menus and food language being based on the 5 food groups and not on low fat, high fibre, low salt concepts. It was actually around the 5 food groups. And obviously I saw infrastructure to prepare and serve food. And in Tasmania, we've got quite a lot of schools that are able to do this, but it's not in an orderly way that food is delivered. So just a few little snapshots. These are the dining rooms. Quite often there was a dedicated dining room for the children to go to, but in Japan, all the children ate in their classroom. So we could do a similar sort of approach in Australian schools. There was some quite unique architecture in how tables folded in and out of walls in multi-purpose areas, but in most cases, schools had a dedicated space. This was my very first lunch in Chicago. It was very much plant-based. It was really colourful. There was a salad bar. The children were really enjoying their food. And this continued on throughout my whole Churchill Fellowship. So these are just a snapshot of some of the lunches that I had around the countries that I visited. you could probably guess where they're from. So some recommendations from my Churchill that I've presented to the Tasmanian government, and I plan to also present to the federal government, that I think really feel we need to develop a school food plan that looks at what children eat from when they arrive at school, so breakfast right through to when they leave school. That we need to collect and collate parents and children's attitudes to the delivery of school lunches, remembering that most of the, well, all of the countries that I visited, they have had a school lunch program since World War II ended. And for whatever reason, Australia chose to go the tuck shop way. So we do need to find out how those attitudes would impact on providing school lunches differently. I strongly believe, and it's been discussed obviously at this webinar today, that we need an agricultural procurement process established in state and territory level so that local and Australian produce can be utilised, and there's that sense of pride in using our food. A commitment from federal and state government to fund a school lunch program. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of my presentation, what's happening in Tasmania. I do feel that we need a shift in focus from nutrient-specific assessment of school menus to a robust focus on the 5 food groups, because I think we've got quite down into the minutiae. And I think the Australian dietary guidelines that are going to be reviewed in the next couple of years are already starting to look at the guidelines from that perspective. That we should have school lunches that are cooked from scratch using local, seasonal and minimally processed foods. We've got the food here, we should be feeding our children with the food that we grow. And just the last of my key recommendations, that we have to have appropriately skilled kitchen workforce that are paid for all the hours of work that they do, and that they're valued as part of the school team. Whilst I don't want to lose our volunteer mentality, and in Tasmania we're probably one of the leaders in having quite a big volunteer component in schools, it is important that people that are working in the school kitchen or the school canteen are actually skilled to do so. I really think that the school lunch break provided is for all children, and it needs to be 20 minutes at least where they sit down to enjoy their lunch, often or always with their peers and their teachers, so that aids digestion, and that playtime is in addition to eating time, not as a opponent to eating time. And that the only drinks offered at schools should be water, firstly, and plain milk. There's a few more recommendations there that link to curriculum and also the no confectionery policy, but as I know that most states in Australia do have a no confectionery policy, just not Tasmania. So since I've been back, I've obviously written my report that's been accepted by the Churchill Trust. I'm presenting my findings to identified interested parties, also at state parliament level in Tasmania. I've been able to secure a small amount of funding to trial a school lunch program in 3 schools for a month, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also secured some funding in Tasmania to explore the development of school food plans in 6 schools. This is the menu that we came up with for the 3 schools. It was a 10-day cycle, which we went through twice. We selected the schools because they had a canteen manager who was able to cook this sort of food, and also senior staff that understood the connection between eating well and students learning well and being able to concentrate whilst at school. Some of the key findings, because this has now happened, we're working with the University of Tasmania and the Menzies to evaluate this. I haven't got the report as yet, but I'll get that early next year. But some of the anecdotal evidence is that we've had an increase in attendance. One boy who'd only been at school for 20 days the whole year came every day when school lunch was available. There was teachers, all teachers at the schools that were involved, the 3 schools, saw an increase in calmness before lunch, and then there was also an increase in focus after lunch because the children knew that they were going to be fed and that they were going to enjoy what they were going to be fed, and their tummies were full through having nutritious food in their tummy. There was an increase in students trying new food. It was interesting to sit in the staff room early in the pilot, and teachers were saying, I'm sure that such and such won't eat that food. It's the same sort of language that we hear when parents talk about the foods that their children won't eat. But when the children were sitting eating with their peers, they ate the food in front of them. And so that was quite fascinating. There was obviously a decrease in school ground litter because there were packaged products being brought to school in their school lunch boxes because they were eating from school. There was an increase in students being nutritionally content for the whole afternoon. So even when they got home from school, parents were saying that they weren't raiding the biscuit barrel, etc. They had still enough food in their tummies to sustain them to go outside and play, go ride their bikes, etc. And we saw that, and it was a part of the pilot, that at least 50% of the produce used in the menu had to be of local Tassie food, and that was achieved quite easily. And I budgeted $4 a meal for a 2-course sit-down meal for the children, and the ingredients costs range from $1.52 to $2.20 per student per meal. So that doesn't include the labour, but that accounts for the ingredients. Interestingly though, there was no procurement process. They just went to their usual local supermarket. So there's a huge capacity there to reduce it even less if we had a procurement system in place. So I did want to thank Mr. Churchill for my opportunity to bring the knowledge home of my trip late last year. It's very hard to find a picture of Winston smiling, but I did find one. And if you want any more details, there are my details there, but obviously they'll be available through being part of this webinar. So
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie, and congratulations on your work and the Churchill Fellowship. Yeah, I can say, having had the privilege to travel to the United States and Canada and Argentina myself as a Churchill Fellow some years ago, it's a really amazing experience. And yeah, you've clearly brought back some fantastic findings and lessons, and really embodying the spirit and the intention of the Churchill Foundation by by actually getting your work funded and driving change in Tasmania. That pilot sounds absolutely terrific, and a real glimpse of the potential of what could take place with a properly funded and supported school meals program. So that concludes all our presentations, and that's, I think, really been absolutely fantastic range of experience and perspectives, and some really powerful stories, a great mix of practice and research and policy from around Australia and of course from New England and Vermont. We are right on our scheduled finishing time of 1 o'clock, but in case anyone's got any particular kind of questions that haven't already been addressed in the chat, or if any of the panelists have been listening to each other would like to add any concluding thoughts or remarks or observations, let's with the indulgence, those who need to go obviously will need to go, and thank you for attending, and all the best for a safe and peaceful festive season, and the best for 2021. But we'll, if with the permission of the panelists, we'll stay on for a few minutes more for a little bit of discussion and any further reflections, having listened to to such a wonderful range of presentations. So happy to open up to any of the presenters who, if anyone would like to offer some reflections.
Nick, I wonder if I could just say that this webinar series has just really been outstanding. The presentations, the way you've brought people together from all across Australia, around the excellent experience in Vermont. Thank you to you and the team. I think you've done a really outstanding job, and I'm looking forward to more of these opportunities in 2021.
Thanks very much, Leah. And yes, I really want to acknowledge the hard work of Ariana Lim and Georgia Caravis in doing all the coordination and organising and logistics of putting these series of webinars together. It's been a huge effort, and I think Ariana in particular has done a really fantastic job. So I'd like to acknowledge all that really hard work in making it all possible. And thanks for that, Leah. And certainly it's our intention to continue this and continue these this networking opportunity and experience sharing, practice sharing, research sharing as we go forward into 2021. And I also wish to extend a huge thank you to Jake and Sarah Danley and today with Peter Allison from Vermont and New England in their generosity and making themselves available over in the East Coast of the United States and joining us and sharing their fantastic accumulated experience over 10 years. It's been absolutely invaluable, and we very much hope to continue those relationships going into next year.
I was just going to jump in very quickly and say thank you as well, but also just to reflect, I think, on the potential for international collaboration. I think I highlighted a lot of the differences in sort of the institutional food environment between Australia and America, but I do think there's a lot to learn, and having a bit of a community of practice extending internationally is really valuable, at least from my point of view, and I hope for everyone else as well. So hopefully we can continue these kinds of conversations, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Sophie. And yeah, maybe just if there's a little bit of time, I did mention this in the chat, but I'd be interested to hear what Peter or Jacob got to say about it, because I know it's a live conversation in terms of the differences in institutional procurement between Australia and the States. And Julie mentioned this, the fact that we don't have a universal school meals program, but I know that some advocates and some people in the sector, and Julie yourself, you mentioned this, that that would be a positive thing to do, and particularly with the increase in food insecurity and food injustice and poverty as we've seen over the last 12 months, and with the economic circumstances that we're entering into, this likely to continue. Yeah, maybe Peter, perhaps you made a comment in the chat, but perhaps you might just want to say a little bit more about that in terms of how important that's been in addressing, the growing problem of food insecurity and hunger in the United States, that school meals program.
Yeah, particularly in the lower income communities, urban areas, where because there's an economic threshold for the community that allows the whole school to get, everyone in the school to get access to free lunch and breakfast, as some of the other presenters have mentioned, and summer feeding, and sometimes dinner, and sometimes parents can join them. So it's actually a huge source of food and nutrition for a lot of kids in the US, and the kids who need it the most. And then from there, the big question is, how do you make that food healthier and help improve good nutrition choices down the road, and how to expand access to the school meals program to more of the population, because the kids are right on the edge of that poverty level, and sometimes it's even worse for them. They don't get the access and they can't afford the lunch, and they ended up sometimes just like not eating, and it's a really sad situation in a lot of cases. But from feeding lots of kids who otherwise are food insecure, it's a really important part of the strategy.
Absolutely. And Julie or anyone from Tasmania, with that pilot and with the Premier's committee and looking at potential kind of food and nutrition security strategy for Tasmania, is this on the agenda now at the Tasmanian state government level, a possible school meals program or something of that sort?
It's Julie here. We're very hopeful that the next stage will be to present the findings from the pilot. But one of the recommendations of the Premier's Economic and Social Recovery Advisory Council is that we look at shifting from food insecurity to food security at a community and a school level. So there is definitely that interest in how we do that, how we go about doing that.
Well, I think that would be a great story to watch and support and share learnings from Tasmania across the rest of Australia. And I know that there's a Food and Nutrition Security Coalition that's meeting now in Tasmania. And you know, with Vic Health, there's been the Food Systems and Food Security Working Group in Victoria, which is going to be making proposals for reform to the Victorian government. So there is a lot of momentum. We've gone a bit over time, so just being respectful of that, I think I will conclude here. Again, just a huge thank you to everybody who's joined us today, and to the presenters, to Jake and Peter from the East Coast of the United States, to Leah and Julie from Tasmania, to Veronica and Sophie from Victoria, and to Tim from Western Australia. Thank you all so much for sharing your wonderful experience and knowledge with us today. Thank you everyone who's attended, and on behalf of Sustain, I'd just like to wish you all a wonderful festive season. Stay safe, stay well, enjoy yourselves, have a great rest. It's been a very hard year for us all, and looking forward to coming back and seeing all of you and continue these conversations for food system change in Australia and globally in 2021. So
Thanks, Nick.
we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Lovely to meet
everyone.
you. Yeah.
See you stateside, Peter and Jake.